Book 2. The Conquest of the Belgic Tribes. 1. Collapse of the Belgic coalition. 57 BC. 1. While Caesar was in Italy and the legions in their winter quarters, repeated rumors reached him alleging what was confirmed by dispatches from Labienus, that all the Gallic tribes, whose territory, as said above, comprises a third of Gaul, were conspiring against the Romans and exchanging hostages. Their action was said to be due to two causes. In the first place, they were afraid that if all the rest of Gaul was subdued, our troops would advance against them. Secondly, they were instigated from various motives by a number of Celtic Gauls. Some of these were as much annoyed by the sight of a Roman army wintering in Gaul and establishing itself there as they had been by the continued presence of the Germans in their country. Others, fickle and inconstant, merely hankered after a change of masters. There were also some adventurers who saw that under Roman rule they would not find it so easy to usurp thrones as was commonly done in Gaul by powerful men and by those who could afford to hire mercenaries. 2. These alarming reports induced Caesar to raise 2 new legions in Italy and to send them in the spring to Gaul under the command of Quintus Pedius, one of his generals. As soon as forage began to be plentiful, he joined the army in person and instructed the Senones and the other tribes whose territory bordered on that of the Belgae to find out what was going on among them and inform him. As their reports all agreed that troops were being levied and concentrated, he decided that he must take the offensive at once, and, after arranging for a supply of grain, he broke camp and in a fortnight was on the Belgic frontier. 3. On his arrival, which owing to the speed of his march was quite unexpected, the Remi, the nearest of the Belgae to Celtic Gaul, sent Iccius and Andicombogius, the leading men of their tribe, to tell him that they placed themselves and all they possessed under the protection and at the disposal of the Roman people. They explained that they had taken no part in the conspiracy which the rest of the Belgae had planned against the Romans, and that they were ready to give hostages, to obey his orders, to admit him into their strongholds, and to furnish corn and other supplies. The remainder of the Belgae, they said, were up in arms, and had been joined by the Germans living on the Gallic side of the Rhine. And all of them were possessed by such fury that even the Susiones, their own near kinsmen, who enjoyed the protection of the same laws as themselves, and obeyed the same king and the same magistrate, had refused to listen when they tried to deter them from joining the movement. 4. On being asked for the names of the tribes that had taken up arms, and particulars of their numbers and military strength, the envoy stated that most of the Belgae were descended from tribes which long ago came across the Rhine from Germany and settled in that part of Gaul on account of its fertility, expelling the former inhabitants. The Belgae, they said, were the only people who half a century earlier, when all the rest of Gaul was overrun by the Teutoni and the Cimbri, prevented the invaders from entering their territory, the recollection of which made them assume an air of much importance and pride themselves on their military power. Regarding their numbers, the Remi professed to have detailed information, explaining that they were united with the various tribes by ties of blood and marriage, and knew the strength of the contingent that each had promised at the general council of the Belgae. The most powerful of all, they said, were the Bellovaci, on account of their bravery, prestige, and large population. They could muster 100,000 troops, had promised 60,000 picked men, and claimed the direction of the whole campaign. The Susiones, near neighbours of the Remi themselves, had an extensive and very fertile territory. They had been ruled within living memory by Diviciacus, the most powerful king in Gaul, who controlled not only a large part of the Belgic country, but Britain as well. Their present king was Galba, to whom, as a just and able man, the supreme direction of the war was being entrusted by common consent. He possessed 12 strongholds, and undertook to furnish 50,000 troops. An equal number was promised by the Nervi, who were considered by the Belgae themselves to be their fiercest fighters and lived farthest to the north. The Atrebates were to provide 15,000 men, the Ambiani 10,000, the Morini 25,000, the Menapi 9,000, the Caleti 10,000, the Veliocases and the Viromandui 10,000 between them, and the Atuatuci 19,000. The Condrusi, Eburones, Kerosi, and Paimeni, who are all known to be German tribes, thought they could raise an army of about 40,000 strong. 5. Caesar addressed the Remi in gracious and reassuring terms, telling them to send their whole council to him and to place the children of their leading citizens in his hands as hostages. These orders were carefully and punctually obeyed. He impressed upon Diviciacus the Aeduan the importance, alike for Rome and for the general safety of Gaul, of preventing the junction of the various enemy contingents in order to avoid the necessity of fighting such powerful forces all at once. He explained that the best way of effecting this was for the Aedui to invade the land of the Bellovaci and start devastating it, and dismissed Diviciacus with orders to do so. When, however, he learned from his patrols and from the Remi that the Belgae had already completed their concentration and were approaching, he hastily crossed the river Aisne, just within the borders of the Remi, and encamped. This movement enabled him to protect one side of his camp by the river and to secure his rear, and assured the safety of the convoys that were to be sent up by the Remi and others. The river was spanned by a bridge, at the head of which he placed a strong guard, leaving one of his generals, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, on the left bank with 6 cohorts. He ordered the camp to be made with a rampart 12 feet high and a trench 18 feet wide. 6. 8 miles away was a town of the Remi called Bibrax, which the Belgae, directly they reached it, assaulted so violently that the garrison had difficulty in holding out to the end of the day. The Belgae have the same method of attacking a fortress as the rest of the Gauls. They begin by surrounding the whole circuit of the wall with a large number of men and showering stones at it from all sides. When they have cleared it of defenders, they lock their shields over their heads, advance close up, and undermine it. These tactics were easy to employ on the present occasion, for with such a large force hurling stones and javelins, no one could possibly stay on the wall. When night stopped the assault, Iccius, the governor of the town, a Roman nobleman who was very influential with his countrymen and had been one of the envoys deputed to ask Caesar for peace, sent word that unless relieved he could not hold out longer. 7. Shortly after midnight, using as guides the men who had brought Iccius's message, Caesar sent some Numidians, Cretan archers, and Balearic slingers to help him. Their arrival restored the morale of the Remi and filled them with fresh ardor for the defense of the town, while the enemy gave up hope of capturing it. Accordingly, after staying there a short time longer, the Belgae proceeded to ravage the countryside and to burn all the villages and homesteads within reach, and then marched their whole army towards Caesar's camp, and themselves encamped barely 2 miles away. The smoke and flame of their watchfires showed that their camp stretched for about 8 miles. 8. As the Belgic forces were very strong and had a great reputation for bravery, Caesar determined at first not to fight a general action, but he engaged every day in cavalry skirmishes in order to discover what the enemy could really do and how his own men stood up to them. And he soon found that his troops were as good as theirs. The ground in front of his camp was ideal for deploying the army for action. The low hill on which the camp stood was of just the right width on the side facing the enemy for the legions to occupy in battle formation. On each flank it descended steeply to the plain, while in front it formed a slight ridge and then sloped gently down. On either side of the hill Caesar had a trench dug, running for about 650 yards at right angles to the line along which the troops would be drawn up, and placed redoubts and artillery at both ends of each trench to prevent the enemy from using their numerical superiority to envelop his men from the flanks while they were fighting. He left the 2 newly enrolled legions in camp to be used as reinforcements wherever they were needed, and drew up the other 6 in front in line of battle. The enemy also had marched out and deployed for action. 9. There was a small march between the 2 armies. The Belgae waited in the hope that our troops would try to cross it, and our men stood with weapons in their hands, ready to pounce upon them at a disadvantage if they attempted to cross first, while in the meantime a cavalry skirmish went on between the lines. Since neither side would make the first move, as soon as the cavalry fight ended in our favour, Caesar led the infantry back into camp. The Belgae then marched straight from their battle position to the Aisne, which I have explained was in the rear of our camp. They found a ford and tried to get a part of their forces across, intending to storm a redoubt commanded by Sabinus and break down the bridge, or, failing this, to deprive us of a very useful source of supplies for the campaign by devastating the land of the Remi, and to cut our communications. 10. On being informed of this by Sabinus, Caesar crossed the bridge with all the cavalry, the light-armed Numidians, the slingers and the archers, and advanced against them. A fierce battle ensued. He attacked them in the river, which impeded their movements, and killed a large number. Others made a very daring attempt to cross over the dead bodies, but were driven back by a shower of missiles, while some of the first-comers who had succeeded in getting across were rounded up and destroyed by the cavalry. The Belgae now realized that their hope of crossing the river was as vain as their hope of capturing Bibracte had proved to be, and that the Romans would not advance into an unfavorable position to fight. Their own supply of grain, too, was running short. Summoning a council of war, therefore, they decided that the best course of action was for every man to return to his own home and wait to see whose territory the Romans invaded first. They would then rally from all parts to its defense, and would have the advantage of fighting in friendly country where their home supplies of grain would be available. In addition to the other reasons, they were led to this decision by the knowledge that Diviciacus and his Aeduans were approaching the frontier of the Bellovaci, whose soldiers were so anxious to go to the help of their own people that they could not be induced to stay any longer where they were. 11. In pursuance of their resolve, the Belgae left camp some time before midnight amid great uproar and confusion, without any proper order or discipline, since every man wanted to reach home quickly and try to get the first place on the road. The result was that their departure resembled a rout. The movement was immediately reported to Caesar by his scouts, but he was afraid at first that an ambush was being laid, because the reason for their retreat was not yet apparent, and therefore kept all his forces in camp. At daybreak, however, the reports of his patrols satisfied him that the enemy really were retreating, whereupon he sent forward the generals Quintus Pedius and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta with all the cavalry to delay the march of their rearguard, and ordered Labienus to follow in support with 3 legions. These troops attacked their column from behind and pursued it for many miles, killing a large number as they fled. For while the rearguard, with which our men were actually in contact, halted and put up a gallant resistance, all those in front, imagining that they were far enough to be safe, and not being under the immediate necessity of defending themselves or under the control of anyone in authority, broke their ranks directly they heard the shouting of the combatants and tried to escape. Thus our troops were able, without any risk, to kill as many of them as there was time to kill. When nightfall compelled them to stop, they returned to camp in accordance with their orders.